He was Australia's most wanted man, but tonight Hakan Ayik is behind bars in a Turkish prison. Ayik, who's accused of running a global drug empire, was sensationally arrested in Istanbul, where he'd been hiding out since fleeing Sydney more than a decade ago.
A gangster so slick, so cocky, and so good at hiding that it took over a decade to track him down. But Sam, the Punisher Abdulrahim, wasn't just any criminal. He was a shadowy figure at the heart of Melbourne's most dangerous crime syndicates. For years, he evaded the authorities, always one step ahead, while his empire thrived in the shadows. He wasn't just a street thug. He was Australia's most wanted man, the mastermind behind a drug empire that smuggled massive quantities of illegal substances into the country. To the world, he was Sam Abdulrahim. But to those who feared him, he was a ghost, a figure whose name sent shivers down the spine of everyone in the underworld. Abdulrahim wasn't just some faceless criminal. He was a persona, a myth in the streets, an individual whose criminal enterprise spanned continents and whose audacity knew no bounds. What made him even more infuriating to the authorities was his bizarre choice to taunt them publicly through social media. He became infamous for his online presence, using Facebook to mock the very people trying to bring him down. The self-proclaimed Punisher was making a mockery of the law, flaunting his wealth and success, knowing that he was untouchable. But let's rewind a bit, because Abdulrahim's rise to infamy didn't happen overnight. He didn't start as a hardened criminal, or even as someone involved in the underworld. He wasn't born into a life of crime, and his early days weren't marked by violence or brutality. In fact, he could easily be a character straight out of a crime thriller, smart, resourceful, and just cocky enough to believe he was untouchable. It didn't take long before Abdulrahim worked his way up the criminal ladder, using his sharp business acumen and razor-sharp instincts. He didn't need to resort to violence. He didn't have to. He knew how to build connections, form alliances, and manipulate situations to his advantage. And soon enough, he had his own network, a criminal empire that became one of the most powerful and dangerous in the world. What's fascinating, though, is how Abdulrahim stayed ahead of the game. Despite his growing infamy, he was a ghost, his movements calculated, his tracks covered. Even when the authorities thought they had him cornered, he slipped through their fingers like smoke. And when he realized his time in Australia was running out, he did what any criminal mastermind would do. He vanished. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. When you think of a wanted criminal fleeing the country, you might imagine a quiet, remote part of the world where they can lay low, blend in. But Abdulrahim wasn't hiding in some backwater country. No, he chose Istanbul, Turkey. Hardly the kind of place you'd expect a fugitive to set up shop. But there he was, living in plain sight, behind the luxury of the city's bustling streets, hidden in a glamorous world of flashy cars, expensive private jets, and five-star hotels. His base of operations, the King's Cross Hotel in Istanbul, which became his fortress, his hideout. It seemed like the perfect cover, a faraway haven for a man on the run. But as we know, no criminal stays on top forever. And as Abdulrahim got comfortable in his lavish life, something started to shift. His arrogance grew. He didn't just believe he was untouchable. He began to flaunt it. He made mistakes, big mistakes. The very same arrogance that once helped him build his empire now led to his downfall. The authorities, having spent years chasing his shadow, started to find clues, small, seemingly insignificant details that began to unravel the facade Abdulrahim had worked so hard to build. One of his biggest mistakes, his careless online presence. While most criminals are savvy enough to stay off social media, Abdulrahim used it as his stage, taunting the police, posting photos of his expensive lifestyle, and showing off his success like he was some untouchable king of the streets. But it wasn't just his posts that gave him away, it was his family. Through a bit of digging, the authorities discovered an Instagram account belonging to his wife, Fleur Messelink. She posted pictures from luxury holidays, high-end cars, and other glimpses of the opulent life Abdulrahim was living. And then came the bombshell. Through further investigation, they learned that Fleur's husband wasn't just any wealthy businessman. He was Sam Abdulrahim, only he wasn't going by his real name. No, in his arrogance, he had changed his name to Han Rees, thinking he could disappear into the world under a new identity. But it didn't stop there. The authorities dug deeper. They found more photos, videos, and even wedding pictures that placed Abdulrahim in Istanbul. They had him. Footage of him inside his hotel, in places where he thought he was safe, became damning evidence. The walls were closing in, and Abdulrahim knew it. His carefully crafted life was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. But despite the evidence, the authorities still had a long road ahead before they could finally capture him. As they closed in on Abdulrahim, they began to understand just how powerful this operation was. His cartel wasn't just a run-of-the-mill drug organization. It was a force to be reckoned with. He had ties to some of the most notorious crime groups in the world. His network was vast, stretching across continents with connections to powerful figures in Asia and beyond. He wasn't just moving drugs. He was controlling the flow of illegal substances with a reach that spanned the globe. And yet, despite all this power, it was his own arrogance, his need to show off, his belief that he could never be touched, that ultimately set the trap that would catch him. For years, Abdulrahim had been playing a dangerous game, one where the stakes were high and the risks were even higher. But in the end, it was his own pride that made him slip. And the authorities, once frustrated and powerless, finally had the evidence they needed to take him down. His downfall, when it came, was as shocking as it was inevitable. The man who had once seemed invincible, who had outsmarted the law at every turn, was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. The man who had taunted the police from behind the screen of his social media accounts was now left with no escape. His empire, built on drugs, violence, and deception, was crumbling around him. As the story of Sam Abdulrahim's downfall unfolds, it's a reminder that even the most untouchable criminals are never truly invincible. No matter how slick or cocky you are, no matter how much money you make or how many lives you ruin along the way, the law always catches up. And when it does, it's as inevitable as it is unforgiving. Abdulrahim may have thought he was untouchable, but in the end, it was his own arrogance, his own carelessness, that brought him down. A look at the bigger picture reveals the true scale of Sam, the Punisher Abdulrahim's criminal empire. What exactly was he running? And how did his rise to power give birth to what's now known as the Aussie Cartel? Spoiler alert, it's far bigger, more dangerous, and infinitely more sophisticated than anyone could have imagined. Abdulrahim wasn't just some run-of-the-mill drug dealer. He wasn't even just a local gangster. He was the mastermind behind a multinational criminal syndicate, a global network of ruthless gangs, cartels, and shady connections that stretched across continents. This wasn't a ragtag collection of petty criminals. It was an international enterprise with fingers in every illicit pie imaginable. And at the center of it all, pulling the strings, was Abdulrahim, a man who, like any savvy business tycoon, understood that in his world, connections were everything. And just like a businessman building a fortune, he built a network that spanned the globe, one deal at a time. But before we dive into the guts of his empire, let's take a step back and understand just how the Aussie Cartel came to be. It all began with a quiet ambition, one that would snowball into a criminal force that struck fear into the heart of Australia and beyond. Good evening, and welcome to the story of Australia's most wanted criminal. A man so cunning, so ruthless, he was more a ghost than a person. He wasn't just a drug lord, he was the puppet master, pulling the strings of one of the most complex and dangerous criminal organizations Australia had ever seen. His operation smuggled massive quantities of drugs, methamphetamine, ecstasy, you name it, into the country, earning him an eye-watering fortune. But it wasn't just the drugs that made him infamous. It was his ability to orchestrate a criminal network so vast, so intricate, that for years, law enforcement was left helpless, one step behind him. But all empires have their cracks, and Abdulrahim's arrogance was about to become his undoing. After years of staying one step ahead, his carelessness began to show. Authorities, once unable to get a lead, started to piece together the puzzle through secret intelligence and an unlikely source, his own social media, Facebook, Instagram. In a chilling twist, the very platforms he used to taunt the police would eventually help bring him down. His online arrogance, his need to flaunt his wealth, and his disregard for the consequences of his actions left a trail that no criminal mastermind could ever hide for long. But let's rewind to the beginning, to when Abdulrahim was just another rising figure in the Australian drug trade. By the early 2000s, he was already building his empire, smuggling in large quantities of methamphetamine and ecstasy. But as his operation grew, so did his ambition. He needed more. More drugs, more resources, more reliable routes to move his product. This is where things got truly interesting. Rather than relying on the usual local criminal networks, Abdulrahim reached out to some of the most powerful and dangerous crime syndicates in the world. He didn't settle for small-time players. No, he went straight to the big leagues. The Russian Mafia, the Chinese Triads, the Mexican cartels. These were the titans of the global drug trade, organizations that controlled everything from production to distribution. These weren't just petty gangs. These were empires that spanned continents, with vast networks capable of moving drugs across the world. How did Abdulrahim manage to secure such powerful allies? Simple. He had connections, and he knew how to use them. He wasn't just another thug looking to sell drugs on the corner. Abdulrahim was a master strategist, and he understood one thing above all else. The key to his success lay in building relationships. He wasn't just importing drugs from one place. He was orchestrating a global operation, bridging the gap between international crime syndicates. And, incredibly, he succeeded. The Aussie Cartel wasn't just an Australian operation. It became the center of a global syndicate. Abdulrahim brought together these international gangs, forming a vast, interconnected criminal web with Australia at its heart. This was no longer just about drugs. It was about creating an empire that could not only produce and distribute drugs, but also launder money, run illegal gambling, and even engage in human trafficking. The scope of the operation was staggering, and its reach extended far beyond what anyone could have predicted. But running an empire of this magnitude required more than just raw power. It needed a steady supply chain, efficient distribution, and most importantly, insiders within key systems. Criminal networks like Abdulrahim's thrive on corruption, and that's where the doors came in. These were the insiders, people working within the system who were willing to turn a blind eye, or worse, actively help facilitate the movement of drugs through customs, airports, and shipping ports. They were the lifeblood of Abdulrahim's operation, ensuring that even when law enforcement was closing in, his shipments still made it through. He didn't rely on luck. He built a network of corrupt individuals who were essential to the success of his business. Abdulrahim's cartel didn't just rely on drugs. It was deeply involved in other illegal activities too. Money laundering, illegal gambling, human trafficking. The cartel's operations were so vast and so well-oiled that they almost ran themselves. But of course, no criminal empire can operate without obstacles, and Abdulrahim had his share of them. Australian authorities were getting closer. They knew Abdulrahim was behind a massive chunk of the drug trade flooding into the country, and they weren't going to let him slip through their fingers forever. But Abdulrahim wasn't just the king of his own empire. He was also fighting a larger, more complicated battle. Within the Australian underworld, there were other gangs, other bosses, other power players. Abdulrahim was constantly navigating a complex web of rivalries, turf wars, and shifting alliances. But what set him apart from the others wasn't just his ambition. It was his ability to outsmart them all. He wasn't simply interested in controlling territory. Abdulrahim's focus was always on expanding his operation, growing it beyond the boundaries of Australia. And to do that, he needed to stay one step ahead of both the law and his competitors. He adapted. He evolved. He forged new relationships, secured new alliances, and ensured that his cartel remained on top. His ability to shift tactics to build new connections was what kept his empire thriving, even as others faltered. But despite all his cunning and all his success, Abdulrahim couldn't escape the inevitable. The walls were closing in. His empire, built on trust, betrayal, and unrelenting ambition, was beginning to crumble. His once carefully constructed network of criminal allies, corrupt insiders, and hidden resources started to unravel. The authorities, armed with intelligence and increasingly powerful tools, were getting closer. The carelessness that had once been his trademark, the arrogant social media posts, the smug online taunts, would ultimately be what brought him down. In the end, it wasn't just the drugs, the money, or the power that made Abdulrahim a force to be reckoned with. It was his network, his ability to create alliances, his knowledge of how to work the system. Despite ACIC's vast network, his wealth, and his unparalleled ability to evade capture, there was one thing he couldn't control: the unstoppable force of justice. The pursuit of ACIC and the Aussie Cartel was a relentless global campaign, and the determination of law enforcement was only growing. Every day, his empire faced more pressure, more scrutiny, and more cracks in its foundation. The pursuit wasn't over, but it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in completely. For ACIC, it must have felt like a cruel twist of fate. His empire, built on secrecy and power, was crumbling from the inside out. His wealth and influence couldn't protect him from the relentless march of justice. The cracks were widening, and soon they would swallow him whole. The final chapter of ACIC's story was fast approaching, and though his empire seemed untouchable for so long, the forces of law and order were closing in. His days of evading the law were numbered. The stakes were high. The cartel's operations had reached unimaginable heights, with devastating consequences. But so too was the commitment of the global authorities to bring ACIC to justice. In the coming chapters, we'll see how this relentless pursuit continues, how each step draws closer to dismantling ACIC's empire, and how the day of reckoning finally arrived for one of the most notorious criminals the world had ever known. The end was near, and there was no escaping the inevitable.